Hi everybody, and welcome to this revision video which goes through classical conditioning with a particular emphasis on the Pavlov experiment. This is part of the psychology of learning topic for stage 2 psychology. Let's get started. So classical conditioning is defined as learning via association of two or more stimuli that are normally unrelated that causes a new conditioned response. It's important to note at this point that classical conditioning always involves an involuntary response or a reflex response. So that may include salivation, blinking, feeling nauseous, etc. But it is a physical response that is a reflex that is not chosen, hence it is involuntary. So classical conditioning is learning a new conditioned response based off of a stimulus that normally wouldn't cause this response. And that is learning via association. So classical conditioning was discovered accidentally by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, who was originally studying digestion in dogs. Now he started to notice that the dogs started salivating or drooling to the sound of the footsteps of the researchers who had their food bowls, rather than the actual food itself when placed in front of them. So this was quite surprising to Pavlov because obviously food will cause dogs to salivate, but they had made an association, hence the definition, between the footsteps and the food. So it was actually the footsteps that eventually caused them to have this new conditioned reflex response of drooling because of the sound, which would have meant nothing to them before. So the dogs had associated the lab assistant's footsteps in particular with being fed, and their natural reflex was salivation. So because of this discovery, Ivan Pavlov, pictured here, decided to do his own very famous and very important trials on classical conditioning with his dogs. So we're going to go through a demonstration with little Dexter here. So Pavlov first presented his dogs with what we call a neutral stimulus. At this point in the conditioning process, the bell means nothing to the dog. They have not had an association and it's not associated with food. So Pavlov would ring the bell and there would be no response from Dexter or no response from his dogs, no reflex, nothing. So the bell starts out as a neutral stimulus. Dexter does not have a natural response to the bell, therefore there's no effect. So then Pavlov needed to determine what will cause salivation naturally or without any intervention. And that's obviously food and water. So, at this point of the trials, Ivan Pavlov presented his dogs with food and water, and of course, inevitably, they salivated. Not because of the bell, which again at this point means nothing to the dog, but because of the food. Now that means that the salivating at this point is an unconditioned or unlearnt response, or a reflex response in other words. And what's going to naturally cause that is food, which is the unconditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned stimulus is what's going to naturally cause the reflex response, which we refer to as the unconditioned response. So unconditioned means unlearnt. So at this point, no learning has actually happened yet. So then Pavlov decided to condition his dogs by making them have an association between the bell and the food. So in the first trial, Pavlov would ring the bell and then immediately present the dog with food. And of course, the dogs would salivate or drool. Now, the very first time that Pavlov did this, the dogs would have been salivating not to the bell, which still means nothing to them at this point, but because of the food. So at this point, the unconditioned response is still salivation, and the unconditioned stimulus remains the food. However, Pavlov was persistent and did this pairing several times. So he repeatedly paired the sound of the bell with the sight of the food. So he would ring the bell, present the food, ring the bell, present the food, and so on and so forth. It's also important to note that once he rang the bell, he immediately presented the dogs with food. That's key in terms of classical conditioning being successful. We're going to talk about that concept in another video. So at this point, the repetition of the pairing of the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and the neutral stimulus of the bell occurred. Now eventually, the dogs learnt, or in other words were conditioned, to associate food with that bell. So in other words, they had learnt that that bell means food is coming. So at this point, classical conditioning had been achieved. So when Pavlov rang the bell, the dogs would salivate. So this new conditioned or learnt response, which is still salivation, is now caused by a new learnt or conditioned stimulus, which is the bell. So again, the dogs had learnt or were conditioned that the bell meant food was coming. Now we know already from what I've said before that bells don't naturally cause dogs to salivate. However, we can learn different reflex responses or conditioned responses by associating two or more stimuli. So if I go back to the definition that we introduced, there we go. Learning via association of two or more stimuli that are normally unrelated that cause a new conditioned response. So in the case of Pavlov and his dogs, the new conditioned response was salivating, but it was salivating to the sound of a bell, which is normally unrelated to causing salivation. So two or more stimuli that are normally unrelated obviously refers to the bell and the food. Another quick recap here. So let's recap. The bell starts out as a neutral stimulus. The food was an unconditioned stimulus. When Dexter salivated upon hearing the food, it was an unconditioned response. So no learning has actually happened yet, as we can see here. So before the conditioning, food would obviously cause the natural unconditioned response of salivation, and the bell was neutral. No salivation, no conditioned response. It meant nothing to the dog. However, by associating the sound of the bell with the sight of the food, which is what Pavlov did, Dexter was eventually conditioned to salivate upon hearing the bell. So the bell is now a conditioned stimulus, and Dexter salivating to the sound of the bell is now a conditioned response. So at this point, behavior has been learnt, and Pavlov discovered that behavior modification is possible through classical conditioning, as demonstrated here. So during the conditioning, the bell was rung and then the dog was immediately presented with food. Salivating is still an unconditioned response until eventually, through several trials or several pairings, the dog had learnt or was conditioned that the bell meant food was coming. So the bell now causes the reflex or conditioned response of salivation. So that makes it the conditioned stimulus. So I hope you found this video useful. In my future videos, we're going to go through more variables and different scenarios regarding classical conditioning. Any questions, as always, let me know. Happy revising!